Hey Beacon Church, thanks so much for watching us online. Before we get to our message today, we want to share a few announcements about what is happening in the life of our church. We want to continue to encourage you to be praying about specific ways that you can love your neighbors and your friends and your families during this time. Be sure to let us know how you're planning to be generous this holiday season by commenting below. We had someone reach out to our family and see if we had family coming in for Thanksgiving, and if not, if we wanted to join them. Maybe you know someone like that who would benefit from an invite like that. We also wanted to give you an opportunity to partner with us and what Beacon Church is doing for Thanksgiving in our community this year. We're partnering with some local organizations to donate items to provide a Thanksgiving meal to families here in our community. You can check out this list right here. We would also love to connect with you. Text WELCOME to 603-932-5238. And when you do that, you'll get a form sent to you that you can fill out and we'll reach out to you. Well, that's all from me, and so now it's on to the message. Have a great week, everybody.
Well, it's great to worship with you here today. I was moving into my first apartment when I moved to New Hampshire. I had my first full-time job, and I moved into an apartment in Manchester. And when I did it, there was a group of church leaders, the church I was working at, Manchester, and they were real generous, and they showed up with a welcome gift. You ever had a welcome gift from somebody? And it was great. I loved it. But the thing that was with this welcome gift was, there's two things that really stuck out to me. The first thing was this. It involved a lot of cleaning supplies. So I don't know what they thought about a 22-year-old recently graduated from college in his own apartment, but that probably tells you a lot right there. But the second thing was this. In this basket, maybe it was a gift that came with it, was this 4-slicer toaster. Now, I felt really bougie when I got a toaster that had 4 slices that you could put in at one time. But the thing with this toaster was, it was actually given by a guy who, he was getting rid of it because 2 of the slices didn't work. But I didn't even care because I'd never had a 4-slicer before. And his wife was mortified, and the next week I had a brand new 2-slicer toaster on my doorstep. But I was thinking about it, I was like, I've already got a 2-slicer. It just comes with a decorative 2-slicer attached to it. And I loved it, so I kept the 4-slicer. It was a great gift, and I loved it. But it's interesting, right? Because one person's trash is another person's treasure, right? You ever see people who, they call themselves dumpster divers? They go to dumpsters and they try to find the treasure that people have thrown away. And maybe you've seen the TV shows about storage wars, where there's storage units that people don't pay their bills and they get auctioned off. And people are excited to root through someone else's stuff to find a unique treasure. You hear about it in the news a lot, right? There's these people who maybe they have relatives that pass away, and they go into their homes and they look around at all the things that really sum up this person's life, and they see all these different items, pictures on the walls, stuff in attics, and maybe it's filled with things like my grandma when she passed away, and she had closets filled with scarves. But there's also people who they find lost Monets or Van Goghs, famous paintings that nobody knew existed, and it was just sitting on a little old lady's wall in the middle of nowhere. It's interesting, right? We're in this series called Shine Bright, and what we're inviting people into is to shine bright like the stars as we follow after Jesus. That as Christians, we're Christ followers, and we want to follow what Jesus is calling us into. And today, we're going into this message today called Living Generously. And I want to broaden our idea of generosity today. We're not just talking about money. Anytime you go to church and it's a series on generosity, everyone's like, oh, great, here we go. put your wallets away and hold tight. It's one of those things, right? But I want to broaden our horizon today with this idea that generosity isn't just financial. There's so many different elements to a generous life. If you took a moment right now, would you say that your life right now is one of generosity? What do you think? We're inviting us to live generously with our time, with our money, our resources, our treasures, but also with our giftings. What does it look like to live generously with everything that we have? And so today we're going to be continuing in this series, Shine Bright, and our memory verse is found in Philippians 2:14. Anybody use this verse this week? It's a great verse. I love it, and it's one that I keep in my pocket to remind myself. Philippians 2:14. It's on the screens. Let's read it together. It goes like this: Do everything without arguing or grumbling. I got it backwards. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. There we go. It's one of those verses that's so easy to lose sight of, right? But yet, in order to live a life that's shining bright for Jesus, you can tell the people who don't live that. The people that argue, the people that grumble. You can tell the people that live a life where everything seems to be a negative. And so today, we want to remind ourselves what it means to shine brightly, but especially when it comes to generosity. So we're going to stay in Philippians, and I'm going to read a passage earlier on in that chapter, Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. And Paul, he's talking to this church in Philippi. So Philippians is a letter that Paul wrote to one of the churches that he started. And these Christians in Philippi, they were a church that was struggling within their Christian community with unity and with love. And so Paul, he's writing to them, and he's giving them admonishments, he's teaching them on different things. And so verse 3 goes like this: Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. He says, let nothing be done out of selfish ambition. Interesting. We can get so caught up in our own lives, right, where we don't even see it as a negative. We're just living our life. We're just doing things that we need to do, that we're going to get by. But Paul right here, he's saying that the first step to this kind of unity is living without selfish ambition, where we value others above ourselves, where we live in this community, where we look at other people and we say, because of my love for Jesus, this vertical connection with God, out of that, I look at my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, and I love them. And that love manifests itself in this unity and in this living outside of the flesh. Because when we forget the whole connection vertically with God, when we're living just for ourselves, that's not when unity really comes about. And so in this, Paul's talking to these people. He's saying that this love that you have for yourself, it needs to be put aside so that you can out of the advancement for the gospel, out of the unity in our community, we can love one another. There was a Spanish marathon runner. His name was Ivan Fernandez Anaya. And he found himself at a pivotal moment in this race. He's running a marathon in his home country in Spain, and it's coming to the close of the race, and he's in second place. And as he's running the marathon, there's this Kenyan athlete right in front of him, and this guy had clearly won the race. But the problem was, as he was running, he stopped about 10 meters short of the finish line. And you know, if you want to really run a race, you've got to finish the race, right? And so as he's running, the Kenyan stops, and he's tired. He's run this marathon. He's standing there, and he's looking around, and all these people are yelling at him. But he doesn't speak Spanish. And so he's looking around. He's like, what's going on? What's wrong? And he thinks he's won the race. And this Spanish marathon runner, Ivan, comes up to him, and he's standing there, and he's at this pivotal moment where he has a choice to make. And what I love is this picture. Let's put that picture up on the screen. This picture of these two runners. Because you know what Ivan did? The corner of choosing whether or not to show this guy his error or to run straight past him and win the marathon, he stopped and he explained to the guy that the finish line was 10 meters down the road. That to me is a crazy example of someone that put aside their selfish ambition, their own idea of what they wanted to achieve, and in that moment, helped someone else. What would you do if you had that opportunity? You've trained hard, right? You speak the language, you know the race, you see the finish line. It's not your fault that that guy didn't know what he was doing. What would you do? It's kind of a tough decision, right? It said after the race that Ivan, his coach, was furious. But I don't think his coach really got it. Ivan knew in that moment that he needed to do something other than run straight past that guy. Now, I think that there's a direct correlation between our actions and our heart, right? There's a direct correlation where his coach was like, you should have won the race, you should have ran past him, this is what we trained for, you knew what to do. But Ivan, in his heart, I think he knew what the right thing to do was. I also wonder what he would have felt like if he would have beaten the guy and just won the race. Do you think he really would have felt like, oh man, I won that race? We all have opportunities like this, right? There's a direct correlation between our heart and our actions. And we can do some really extreme, silly things when something has a hold of our heart, right? Anybody remember any stories when they were first dating the lady that they're married to right now? Has your wife ever gotten you to do things that you would never do if it wasn't for her? We were at a wedding last night, and I don't like to dance. That's just not in my bones. It's not in my body. My body doesn't really move rhythmically. We're on the dance floor, and it's hard enough for me to clap on time. And so I'm clapping, and my wife's like clapping off beat because she was like, oh, I'll clap like you. Literally, this is happening on the dance floor, and it's just not within me to do that. But there's certain things that because you love her, you do them, right? There's certain things that capture your heart, and if it's got hold of your heart, you're going to do some things, and sometimes you look a little silly while you do it. There's a direct correlation between our actions and our heart, and this is why I would start today's message by saying that generosity starts in the heart. Generosity starts in our heart. So today, if you were to take a check of your heart, what has hold of it? What has its hands on your heart? What are the things that you care about, the things that you love? What are the things that you desire to be a part of? What has a hold of your heart today? It's an interesting notion to think about that there's certain things that I love, and because I love them, I do certain things. There's certain things that I don't love, certain things that I, in fact, would go as far as saying that I despise, and so I try not to do them. What has a hold of your heart today? I think that Jesus, he knew that there was this correlation between our heart and our actions, between generosity and what we love. In Matthew 6, he says, verse 21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. When it comes to generosity, the things that we love, the things that have a hold of our heart are going to be the things that flow out of it, right? So if we are truly built in a way where our heart is filled with generosity, by definition, what's going to flow out of it is going to be generosity. And so when we think about what has a hold of our heart, we need to make sure that we're capturing it in a way where we don't allow things to enter that shouldn't be there. We don't allow things to take a hold of us that shouldn't be there. We break them off and we fill it with the things that should be there. So what do you love? If you were to look at your life today, you say, I love this. What is it? Is it someone? Is it someone that you've been with for many years? Is it something? Something that you've worked hard for and you earned it. There's things that we earn, and it's okay to love things, right? Is it the number in your bank account that you've worked really hard to get to? What is it that you love? Maybe you could say it this way: the things that capture our heart direct our actions. The things that capture our heart direct our actions. It's what we follow. And so when we look at our life, you don't just end up in a random place in life and you've just stumbled your way there and you're like, oh, how on earth did I get here? Like, it doesn't happen that way, right? It's a process of small steps over time, sometimes mixed in with a few giant leaps, sometimes of faith, sometimes out of selfish desire, ambition. You don't just get there and one day you're like, oh, how did I end up here? No, you either deliberately got there or you deliberately chose these small steps that led you that direction. So what has hold of your heart today? What is it that you love? What's directing your actions? What are you so into that it means it flows out of you? I want to give you guys just like 30 seconds. Turn to the person around you and say, just share, what is the thing that you really love right now? And yes, it's weird and awkward, but I think you guys will be able to do it. Just go ahead, 30 seconds. All right, we can bring it back in. I personally love the fact that we have a church where we can do things like that. Where I don't have to worry about like a huge room and it's weird and awkward, that we can just connect. And because I get to share a message from God, but I also, I love inviting people to participate in this. So I love that we get to do things like that. Paul, he goes on to say in Philippians 2, verse 5, I'm going to read through verse 11. He says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross, verse 9. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. When it comes to our lives, not just generosity, but as a whole, a holistic viewpoint of our lives, the reality is that a Christian, by definition, is a Christ follower. That's what we're called to do. We're called to follow after Jesus. And so when we read verses like this in Philippians chapter 2, it can be kind of scary. Because if you see what Jesus did, he went to the cross. He emptied himself. He lived a life that was about serving others and not being served. And so if we're to follow Jesus, where are we going? I don't know if you've ever thought about it that way, but if we're to follow Jesus, the call is death. Now, it doesn't stop there, right? We follow him to the cross. We die to ourselves, where the person that we are, all our desires, all our wants, all our wishes, all our selfishness, all our sin, all Calvin, all you, dies. When you say, okay, Lord, I want to be forgiven. I come to you and ask for forgiveness and I repent of my sins and I want to receive this new life, you first have to die to yourself. And when you die to yourself, the moment that happens, that the Spirit comes within you, you're invited to step into, remember that idea of we don't just get somewhere by accident, we take steps? So you're invited to step into this new life. So there's a death, but then there's also new life. Jesus died on the cross, but then he was also resurrected and he came to life, and that's what we celebrate at Easter. And so when we think about living generously, we see the fact that Jesus exemplified generosity. Everything about Jesus was generous. From coming down from earth, think about it. If we contrast the story of Jesus to the story of Adam, they were both there pretty much at the beginning. Adam was a little after. But they were there, and so Jesus, he was in heaven, he was living his life with the Father, with the Spirit, and he came down to earth and he emptied himself. He died on a cross, rose from the dead, he served other people, he gave generously of himself with his hands open, right? So that we could take life, so that we could be given life out of it. And then we contrast it to Adam. So if you know the Garden of Eden story where Adam and Eve, they were created by God, Adam first, and then out of Adam, Eve was created so that Adam would have a helper, a person to live with, and in that, so that he wouldn't be alone, and in that, Adam and Eve, in the Garden of Eden, they lived with God. They had life. And so they had all the life that they needed. They lived in the blessings and the glory of being in God's presence. But instead of what Jesus did with his hands open, Adam and Eve saw an apple on a tree. Now, we don't want to oversimplify it, where Adam and Eve didn't just take an apple and eat an apple and like, oh, that was a bad boy, you shouldn't have just eaten that apple. There's a little more to play at that. The apple represented life, right? The knowledge of good and evil. It represented everything that God was. And Adam and Eve, they wanted it. So Jesus is there and he's saying, here you go. Take, I've emptied myself. Take this grace, this mercy, this new life. And Adam, his example is, oh, I see the life I want. I'm just going to take it. Eve was with him. There's a contrast between the two. And when we talk about following Jesus, this Christian thinking is kind of like an upside down view of economics. Most economists would tell you that if you have resources in front of you and you can take them, you should, right? You should invest in the things that you're going to get greater returns. You should do things that make sense. You should make good choices. And if you make enough good choices and you have a little luck with you, then you're going to do great. And you'll have lots of money, lots of time, lots of whatever it is. There's some basic economics in that. But Jesus is inviting us into this upside down version of economics. Well, it gets a little crazy because he says, it's better to give than receive. No, it's not. I got less. What if I don't have anything to give? What if I needed that? Well, it's better to give than receive. Even as a child, they can understand that, right? There's a commercial that is quite often played on TV, and there's two little girls, they're sisters, and it's this like little cutesy commercial, and they say, who's the tallest? Take a piece of chocolate. Take it. And then they go, who's the best at sharing? And this is when it gets really cutesy, because one of the girls goes, oh, me. Takes one and gives it to her sister. Like even kids get it, right? They get this idea of it's better to give than receive, and yet innately inside of us, we don't live that way. And so Jesus, he's calling us into this upside down version of economics where he came to serve, not be served. And so if we're to look at Jesus and he's the example of what to follow with a life that's filled with generosity, I think the first thing comes to mind is the fact that we need to actually follow how he lived. Do you live that way? Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's bad to invest your money in wise investments. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it's wrong to earn money. I'm not saying it's wrong to be wealthy. I'm not saying it's wrong to work hard. Any of that, that's just not what we're talking about today. But what is wrong is if our heart is held by things that aren't what Jesus wants in our heart. That's what's wrong. So if for you it is specifically money that has a hold of your heart and you can't separate it, then maybe you need to come to the cross, die to yourself, and ask Jesus to release you from that. But it might not be money. It might be relationships, it might be things, it might be people, it might be work. I don't know what it is for you, but Jesus, he's inviting us into something different. This idea of living generously. So today, we're gonna in a minute see a video about someone who's a part of our community that lives generously, and I just want to share that story with you. But before we do that, we just want to invite you to think about what is your purpose in life. Because if your purpose in life is to have all the most amazing friends that you could ever have, then you invest in that, right? Ways to get there. If your purpose in life is to be able to retire early with all the money you need, then absolutely you invest in that. If your purpose is such, then you build action steps, smart goals to get there, right? So today I want us to think about if our purpose is to follow Jesus, then what does it look like to live generously? Check out this video.
My name is Derek Trudell, and I'm originally from Manchester, New Hampshire. I was born and raised here in New Hampshire. When I was 19 years old, I went into the military. I spent 24 years in the military, traveling around the world, and then I retired and came back to New Hampshire. And now I'm a small business owner, and I attended Manchester Christian Church for quite a few years, and then when Beacon Church opened up, I wanted to come and help support Beacon, and so here I am. just in men's group, I brought in a commentary, and one of the guys in the group saw the commentary and thought that was really neat and wanted to know where I got it. So I said, well, either local Christian bookstore. I think I got some online. And so he looked, but he couldn't find that commentary. So the Lord moved on my heart and said, hey, why don't you go down? Because in Nashua, I know there's a Christian bookstore. So I went down there and I was going to buy him the book of 1 Peter, because that's what we're studying in our men's group. But then the Lord said, why don't you get him a couple more books? So I did get him quite a few books. And then afterwards, I called him and said, hey, why don't you let him come to the house and I'll drop him off. But he was coming into Manchester, so on the following Saturday. So he came with his wife, and then when I presented him with the books, he was just really thrilled. But then, of course, he wanted to give me money. And then with that, it gave me the opportunity to tell him a story, tell him multiple stories about being intentional about giving and how God will work in your life. Kelly, my wife and I, Kelly, were in a restaurant, and there was it seemed like a caregiver with an elderly woman. We're eating, and so the Lord said to me, He said, why don't you give them money to pay for their meals? So I mentioned to Kelly, is that okay? And she goes, why don't we just pay for their meals and don't give them money? We'll just tell our waitress that we want to pay for it. So when the waitress came, we explained to her, what we want to do, and she said, well, that's really nice of you. And so that's what we did. And then we had an opportunity later on to witness to our waitress about how God's love and God's blessing, that He wants us to be cheerful givers. Again, it's that intentional looking for ways besides just paying tithing, besides just having the church have a time where you're bringing food for Thanksgiving. It's living a life of allowing to be a blessing, to be able to give whenever God moves on us to give.
I love that. This idea of living a lifestyle of generosity. Now I think that our church, I know that our church is a very generous church. I see it in many different ways. And so I know we have so many different stories of people that take that step to be generous. But the reality of this is, it's not just about doing a kind act. Because we can do nice things for people all we want. But the thing that opens up when you do that, the real reason that I love, that really gives us the opportunity in that, is the fact we get to share with people the purpose and reason behind it. And that's what I think Jesus wants us to do. As we're generous, people start wondering why. We live in a world where if you give something to someone, they're like, what do you want back in return, right? And when we say nothing, they get a little weirded out. You get the opportunity to have a conversation where you can just share about the reason, the joy that comes out of it. And even if they just reject all of that conversation about Jesus, you know that God was thankful. He was honored in what you did. And so I'd encourage you to be thinking about, what does it look like to be generous? One of the ideas that comes along with generosity is this thought of being a steward. Now, a steward is someone who's a manager, or it's a manager or someone who looks after someone else's property. That's what a steward is. Now, maybe we have people that have jobs where you actually act kind of like a steward for the person who owns the house or the business or all that kind of stuff. But there's a story that Jesus tells in Matthew 25 that really just defines this whole idea of what it means to be a steward. He talks about how there's this master that's going on a trip, and the master entrusts bags of gold to these 3 servants. He gives to one servant 5 bags of gold. The other 3, and the last one he gives 1 bag of gold to. And if you know this story in Matthew 25, it goes such where the master leaves, and the first 2 servants take the bags of gold, and they know what the master is about. They know that the master is a hard master. He works hard. He wants to invest. He wants to earn more. He wants things to go a certain way. And so they run after what the master is about. They go to work. They put the money to work. They do all these different things so that when the master comes home, they know he's going to be excited to see what they did. And then the third person, the third servant, he had 1 bag of gold. And in this passage it says that he wanted to make sure that he could safeguard it because he knew the master was a hard master, and he knew that if he lost it, he was just scared to lose it. So he went and buried it in a hole. Now, if you think about when the master came home, who do you think was excited to see the master come walking down? I don't know if the last one was. I guess he hadn't lost it. But the first two, I can just imagine, like, oh, we made some more. He's going to be excited. I want to show him. Like a little kid coming home with their artwork that they created at school. They're just excited to show the parent, right? And the first two, I'm sure he was. And the master was like, well done, good and faithful servant. I entrusted you in a little. I'm going to entrust you in even more. And then he gets to the last guy. And the last guy was like, Master, I know, like, I didn't want to, I this, that, the other. You just hear it, right? Like all the excuses that we make up. Like, oh yeah, I was scared, I was nervous, I thought about this, but then I didn't do it, but here's your gold back. Well, he didn't lose anything, so was it bad? Well, it wasn't about who, he knew the master, he didn't do what the master wanted him to do, and so the master goes, you wicked and lazy servant. Very extreme language. But he was not happy with what the servant had done because the servant knew better. And so when we talk about our lives, Jesus is using this as an example to relate to us. He's saying that I've entrusted in you time. I've entrusted in you treasures, giftings, talents. You are mine, and as a Christian, you're invited to be a part. In fact, you're not just invited, you're compelled to be a part of God's business. And God's business is to tell people about who Jesus is. It's to glorify God. And so when we think about our lives and living generously, we need to ask ourselves that question. Am I using my resources, my time, my talent, my treasure for the things that glorify God? Or am I just burying it in the ground? Just getting by? Just living life? Just investing in things that I want, that I desire? We're really just stewards of our own lives. It's kind of a weird weird thing to think about, right? That your life isn't your own anymore as a Christian. Like, oh, isn't that just a great selling point to non-Christians? Hey, come be a Christian where you don't get to be the owner of your own life anymore. But Jesus, this new life you step into where you become a steward, there's so much joy that comes out of it. In this, we can see that we're stewards, not owners. So if we're going to be a generous person, we would invite you to think of this, that generous people live as stewards, not owners. So what is it in your life specifically right now that you've been entrusted with, that you're a steward of? Maybe you don't have a whole lot of money, but you got a lot of time. How are you using it? Maybe you don't have a whole lot of time because you're working hard and you got a whole lot of money. How are you using that? Maybe you ain't got any time or any money, but you got some gifts. How are you using it? God has His purpose for our lives, and He wants us to live in this upside-down economic viewpoint where giving is better than receiving, where our hands are open, where we're living to glorify God, and we're using everything we have for the Master's work. This is what it's about to be a Christian. So first, generous people live as stewards, not owners. But secondly, I think that generous people create margin in their life. You ever felt busy, overworked, stressed, about to burn out? You ever felt like, oh man, if my weekend was so packed, if I had one more thing, I would just lay down and just not be able to do anything else. And then the kids come home and they tell you about the project that's due the next night. There's so many things that we can live like, and I think that there's this equation when it comes to margin. It looks like this. We can put it up on the screen. Margin is abilities, your limits. You can go ahead and put the next slide up. Minus your responsibilities, your load. That's what margin is. So your abilities, your resources, your time, your gifting, things that you have to offer, minus things that are expected of you, your responsibilities. You ever feel like your responsibilities just grow so high that you don't have the abilities to cover it? If that happens, you just don't have margin in your life, right? Anybody feel like their margin's pretty low these days? So how do you create more margin? What's the impact of margin in this? Well, it's funny that we talk about it because Martin Luther, who was a famous theologian, when he talks about being overworked, overloaded, here's what he says. I have so much to do, I shall spend the first 3 hours in prayer. Isn't that what you think when you got so much to do? Put that on the back burner, I got to go pray. Probably not. So why? What is he talking about? Well, this idea of abundance versus scarcity. Just think about it for a second. We have a finite amount of time in our lives, right? 24 hours in a day. I don't care who you are, you've still got 24 hours in a day. We have a finite amount of time. And it's easy to live within this scarcity mindset of, I can't get more time. I got to do this. If I don't do this, if I don't do that, then things aren't going to go the way they're supposed to go. If I don't run faster and harder and do more and more and more, then I'm not going to get where I want to go. So how does that align with this generous lifestyle that Jesus is inviting us into? Well, I think that it goes into this abundance mindset. This idea that you don't have to live out the scarcity of what you can do through your own flesh on your own, because you have a connection with the abundant Father. The Father that has the ability and availability to give you everything that you need. And so when Martin Luther says he's going to pray, you know why? Because God's got the answers. If we're to live a life generously, I think we need to build in some margin in our lives so that we don't have overload, whether it's some examples of that, activity overload. Just got so much stuff going on. Change overload. There's so many changes, your brain is exploding, you can't cope with anything else. Maybe it's commitment overload. Any overcommitteds in the room? You double book yourself and then you realize that you've actually triple booked yourself. There's so many different ways we can get overloaded. It can be debt overloaded, where you get in such debt that you just can't get out. And then you're like, oh yeah, be generous with your money. How? I have so much debt, I'm crippled. How can I be generous? Or maybe it's decision overload. You're just tired of making a decision. And it can be tough, right? When you want to be generous, then you're like, well, how do I be generous? Like, who do I give it to? What do I do? If I do that, are they going to respond in a positive way? Are they going to use that money for something bad? And we just kind of get into this mindset of paralysis in the end, because I don't even know what to do. That's my one of my pitfalls is. I'll think so much about it, then in the end, I just throw my hands up and say, all right, God, I don't know. What do you want me to do? He just wants me to act. He wants me to listen. In Proverbs 23, verse 4, it says this, do not wear yourself out to get rich. Well, that's convicting, right? Do not trust your own cleverness. Think you're clever? Cast but a glance at riches, and they are gone, for they will surely sprout wings and fly off to the sky like an eagle, as the bank account goes lower and lower and lower and lower. It's really interesting, right? God has this invitation where he's saying, I want you to live in this abundance mindset, not a scarcity of what you can do, what you have. With your talents, with your time, with your treasure. I think that we need to review who we are and how we're living and ask ourselves often, what has a hold of my heart? Is it aligned with the priorities of who Jesus is? Am I following his example? Am I giving or am I taking? There's a lot of practical side of things that we can kind of go over in this. But I really think that the question I want to ask is, how can you create the margin in your life today so that you can stop and hear from God in what he wants you to do? What is that going to look like? Because if we don't do that, how can we expect to hear from him, to follow after him, when we're so busy I can't hear anything? When we're so busy that I get so caught up in things that instead of directing my own activities, my own schedule, my schedule and activities drive me. Next thing you know, you're wondering, what did I do this weekend? I'd never planned that. How did this even happen? It's just one thing after the next. How can we hear from God today? What I love is in Matthew 25, the servants who followed the master's wishes. Verse 21 says this. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. What an amazing testament. Where God entrusts us with things. We glorify him in what we do. We follow his wishes. We're part of the master's work. And he blesses us and invites us into the happiness that only comes from him. God entrusted him with more. Generous people, they're stewards, not owners. And then they create margin. And the last thing is this as we close. Generous people act. We can say we want to be generous. We can think we want to be generous. But do you act on it? I was driving down the street the other day around Panera area, and there was this guy hitchhiking. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't often pick up hitchhikers these days. It's not like what I hear in the past with my parents and grandparents, like where people would do that as much. And it crossed my mind. I was like, God, no. He could be a scary guy. There's COVID. I don't know if he's weird, could do something. I'm on my own. What? But I just felt this tug. It was like literally just felt like a tug. I guess I can't say literally because it was not a literal tug. But it felt like a tug on my heart. We use words weirdly, right? Felt like a tug on my heart. And I'm sitting there and I'm driving. I was like, but God, my wife is not going to be happy with me picking up a stranger. She's sitting right here. But I knew he wanted me to. So I just prayed. I'm like, okay, God, you're in control. And I picked him up and I had a great conversation. He works at one of the local restaurants. He just needed a ride home. Drove him home and it was great. And then he said, next time you come in, come stop by the kitchen and say, ask for Mike and I'll come on out and we'll chat. And I was just blessed. When God calls you, act. Generous people act. There's so many excuses we can make up. Oh, I need that money for something else. Oh, I don't have the time. I didn't have the time, but I made the time and it all worked out. And even if it didn't, I just felt God's blessing out of it. So this is the invitation today, living generously as people. What would it look like if our world saw generous Christians? Extravagant generosity. In everything we did, we have the opportunity to be generous. And out of that generosity, we can tell people about the reason. Jesus. Let's pray. God, we ask today, Lord, that you would work through us. Give us the ability and the means. Give us the desire and the heart to be generous so that more people can be pointed towards your Son, Jesus. God, we just lift this up in your name.